In today's tutorial, we will use beautiful summery pansies to explore wet into wet watercolor painting. So let's get started. Welcome back. My name's Shayda Campbell. In today's tutorial, we're going to do these wet on wet watercolor pansies. And pansies are a really two-dimensional flower, especially if you compare them to a hydrangea or a peony. And that makes them perfect for practicing your watercolors. They're really simple shapes to paint. And they also have this wonderful burst of color that starts at their center, and that makes them perfect for practicing and experimenting with your wet on wet or wet in wet watercolor technique. So the first thing I'm going to do is mix up the colors that I want to use. Now today I'm using my Koi watercolor set from Sakura, and you can see here I'm just mixing up a nice dark purple. So that's some purple with a little bit of blue in it, a little bit of black even, and mixing lots of water into the paint, of course, on my palette. I'm also using a cold pressed watercolor paper block from Canson, and then I'm using 3 small nylon paint brushes. One is for the purple, one is going to be for when I'm using yellow, and then the other one is just there if so that I have a dry brush so that I can sort of lift paint if I need to. Now you can see here I'm laying down this sort of shape of 4 petals, and I'm just using a very, very light watery paint to do that. So this could be clear paint, except that clear is hard to see, so just go really, really light to get the shape of the flower. And then you're going to start adding darker pigment and lots of that dark, rich black purple right at the center of the flower, and you just let the paint seep out and do its own thing. I'm just going to kind of skip over that first flower because it wasn't my most successful, and we're just going to keep going. I'm going to paint so many, so I hope that you guys will kind of get the feel for how to do this just through seeing me do a bunch. And you can add, you're doing that first initial 4 petals in a very translucent purple, and then you can add that color wherever. So here I'm sort of adding it on the outside of the petals and doing it in little streaks, and then adding a nice yellow right in the center. And this is just, pansies are so great for exploring wet into wet, and you can really see what that means for watercolor paints. So you lay down the shape of these 4 petals in a very wet, watery paint, and then you add that extra pigment right into the center, and you just watch as it just seeps out into the petals, and the paint naturally creates the look of the pansy where the darkest part of the flower is just sort of right at the center, and it's just bursting outward. Another thing is that the pansy is sort of made up of these 3 petals that come together at the front, and then this larger one that kind of flops in behind. So that's something to think about as well. The darkest part is on those front 3 petals. So wet into wet or wet on wet watercolor painting is all about just laying down an initial wash of color, however light or dark, and then adding more paint into that initial wetness while it is still very wet. And as you progress as an artist, you'll sort of learn when to let the paint seep out and do its own thing, and when to guide it. I'm still working on that. As I always mention, I tend to overwork my watercolors, and doing a practice piece like this can really help you let go and say, I'm just gonna see what the paint does. And these pansies are really fun for that because you're doing these super light petals and very wet light petals, and then you take that dark purple, that highly pigmented paint, and you just let it seep out. You just let it hit your initial water wash and just watch what it does. Same with adding the yellow to the very center. You're just allowing that yellow to hit the page and sort of trickle into the purple and watch it move. And yeah, you can move it around with your brush a little, or you might have a dry brush there, as I do, to help you pick up some of the excess water or paint. So you're guiding it, but you're also just letting things happen. And one other thing I want to mention is that while I'm moving on and I keep painting more and more flowers, yes, I start with a puddle wet flower and I allow the purple to seep out into those initial light colored petals. And that's sort of my first wet on wet. And then I'll go on and paint another flower, but then I always come back to the ones that I've painted and I'll add a little more black or purple. And the reason I'm coming back to them is because when you first do that wet into wet, you're going to get a lot of seepage. Your initial wash is still very wet, so the paint is going to go outwards and flow. But then as the paint begins to dry on the page, you'll notice, well, now I can go in with a little black or really dark purple, and I can put some more paint into that area that's still wet, but because it's not puddle wet, the paint isn't going to seep out quite as much. So this is a great time to add some streaks or lines, to add some more depth. Maybe this is when you choose to add the yellow center of the pansy. It allows you a chance to add more detail to the flower without adding real strict, stiff detail, because it's still gonna move a little. That paint is still gonna blend and morph, but you have a chance here to maybe put in a little dark black or golden yellow, and it'll move and blend, but not too much. And that's part of the reason that I love this pansy practice exercise, is that you're able to see the role that time will play in your wet on wet technique. The next shot here is actually a good example of this. This pansy is almost dry, but just not quite, and I'm adding some little streaks, and you can see they're just bleeding ever so slightly, and that just gives it this really wonderful natural look that's perfect for a flower. But you could also use a wet on dry technique to add these little streaks and dots and details to your flowers, so you don't necessarily have to use wet in wet for all of the details. It's also nice to go in at the end when everything is completely dry and just add some of your very, very fine details at that point as well. So totally up to you. And this is, again, just what I love about this piece, is that you can practice all sorts of different things. And the pansies, they always turn out looking beautiful. If you're using a nice, dark, rich, blackish purple and a very, very, very light wash of almost barely there purple to begin, and then going in with that dark black purple, or don't even be scared to use a little bit of black, you're going to get this beautiful contrasting color. And here you can see me lifting a little with a dry brush and pushing the color around a bit, so you're able to just play and try things out and just let the paint do what it wants to do. And good time to let go and not overwork your paints, and just sort of, try to be free with them. And here you can see me adding just a little bit of yellow, and because it is still wet, it just bleeds beautifully into the purple petals. Guys, thank you so much for watching today and following along with me. This is what my painting looked like when it was all done. It's always nice when a practice piece turns into a pretty painting. This week, patrons of my YouTube channel will have access to some of my hand-painted pansy clip art, so head over to patreon.com/Shayda Campbell after the video to grab that. Thank you again for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next week with a new tutorial.